Well, as you can probably tell based on how I look right now, it's once again time for another collaboration with Alternate History Hub, where we each talk about some of Harry Turtledove's books. For this video, I'm talking about his War Between the Provinces series, while Alternate History Hub will be talking about the Darkness series. In the past, we've talked about the long epic series where the South wins independence in the American Civil War and continues the story all the way through World War II. We talked about what if aliens invaded in the middle of World War II and all the factions had to team up to stop them? What if Atlantis was a small continent in the middle of the Atlantic that actually existed? What if MLK hired a guy to protect a missing painting of a royalist George Washington? Okay, yeah, that last one is really oddly specific. You might notice a pattern where, aside from that last one, we first started talking about a more grounded alternate history timeline, but then we've gone into some of Turtledove's works that mix in elements of classical sci-fi or fantasy. While Harry Turtledove has been dubbed the master of alternate history, in truth he's done just as much outright fantasy novels that aren't historical in the slightest. The man clearly likes Tolkien-esque tales as much as history, so it makes sense that he'd mix the two. But there's many ways you could mix ingredients together. Here's a fancy graph I made called the Turtledove graph. The left to right axis is how much high fantasy or sci-fi is involved in the story. The up to down axis is how much divergence from the historical timeline there is. Turtledove has written things all over this graph. If I had to average all of the Southern history books, it's basically here. Things diverge a lot, but not enough to where the setting of the world around World War I or II is completely unrecognizable. And there's no high fantasy or sci-fi elements at all. The World War series? In the center. The geopolitics are changed, but it's not totally unrecognizable. But the involvement of aliens invading and controlling parts of the Earth clearly adds a lot of sci-fi to it. The Atlantis series? While you could cynically say there's a lot of parallels to real-life historical events, the existence of an Atlantean continent has very much made a different world, and the existence of a continent altogether with its own ecosystem is in the realm of fantasy. The Two Georges, meanwhile, probably goes here because the geopolitics are very different, and the changes in technological development is a tiny bit sci-fi, even if mostly grounded. The War Between the Provinces series is a really weird situation in that it would be placed more over here. Now, how could there be this much fantasy but still hardly be a diverged timeline? Well, Turtledove loves historical parallels, but this one is so parallel it's almost just the same line. This series is basically what if the American Civil War had wizards and unicorns. Yes, really. I started reading Harry Turtledove books in middle school when I was gifted one of his books and quite enjoyed it. Then as I grew up, I would walk from school to the nearest public library to wait for my parents to pick me up, and there I would check out more Turtledove books. When it came to Turtledove's more fantasy-leaning works, there were a few I tried and some were okay, while others were, a bit out there. But I have distinct memories of seeing the books of this War Between the Province series, reading the description and going, yeah, no thanks. Sure, seeing medieval Abraham Lincoln or Not Lee and Not Grant playing chess caught my attention, but American Civil War mixed with Tolkien just seemed uninteresting to me, especially given it didn't appear to be an alternate history per se so much as just an alternate dimension of the same history. Cut to 2024 when Alternate History Hub and I were having a discussion on what Turtledove collaboration we wanted to do next. During that I briefly mentioned these books, and it turns out not only did he make a fantasy-style American Civil War series, he also made a fantasy-style World War II series. So we decided that this was a perfect matching theme. So after many years of me judging these books by their covers, I finally decided to read them. Alright, so we already know that this series is the American Civil War, but medieval-ish fantasy. So there's going to be a lot of similarities. I get that, but what's different? Well, basically the North is in the South and the South is in the North. Okay, that needs more explanation. Okay, so the North of the Kingdom of Detina refuses to be loyal to the new king who threatens to abolish serfdom. The South has better supplies and manpower, but the North has better generals, or in this case, wizards. Basically, the cause and layout are analogously the same, but the geography is flipped. Oh, but the colors are flipped as well, where the secessionist North uses blue to distinguish themselves from the royal gray of the South. Well, okay, I suppose that's not flipped, that's or rather it's geographically normal, but politically, well, you get the point. And look, okay, since this is a self-aware retelling of the American Civil War, it makes sense that the setup is going to mostly be the same. But there is one notable change. So the secession is over the new king trying to abolish serfdom. Okay, serfdom is more peasant and medieval sounding, and while technically not the same as slavery, is somewhat close enough of an analogy to work. However, the mark of bondage is not dark skin, but blonde hair. That is kind of a weird choice. Now, considering this book came out in the year 2000, it is worth considering that the culture of discussing American history was in many ways different back then compared to now. If I had to guess, this was probably some weird attempt at making a point, like, oh, maybe you'll view slavery differently if it was with a different demographic. Like, perhaps the average likely demographic of the reading audience of my books at the time? It really makes you think, huh? It sounds like the type of thing that would have been done in like the original Star Trek series. Even if it was good intentioned, it's aged a bit awkwardly. However, the really awkward thing about this series is the naming. Okay, so I like puns, I like joke references. If a book has a character that is supposed to be a parody of a real famous person and has a slightly off name, it can be fun. Or maybe it could work as a thought-provoking analogy. But it's weird when it's not just one character, but rather all of them. That aside, the series can't seem to decide if they want these copies of historical figures to be like alternate dimension exact copies or just analogous. For example, some have entirely different names. Some have different names entirely. General Grant's counterpart is named General Bart. General Rosecrans' counterpart is named General Guildenstern. Rosecrans and Guildenstern happen to be minor characters in Shakespeare's Hamlet, so there's a connection there, but it's not immediately obvious. That works. Other characters' names are closer but different. The presidents Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis are King Avram and King Geoffrey. Technically different, but you can see the obvious analogy. But it seems the most common formula is just taking the historical figure's middle name and using that as the character's name. General Robert Edward Lee is represented as Duke Edward. General John Bell Hood is represented as General Bell. For some reason, Thomas Alva Edison is in the series as Mage Alva, even though the real Thomas Edison had absolutely nothing to do with the actual American Civil War. Then, however, some characters are just J.K. Rowling bad. General James Longstreet is James of Broadpath. General Nathan Forrest is Ned of the Forest. The funniest name, though, is a part of the series where they allude to an analogy of Napoleon, and he's simply named Kermit. You know, like the frog. Jeez. The same problem is there with the naming of the analogies to the states. Some are somewhat clever, like Parthenia for Virginia, because Parthenia comes from the Greek term for virgin. Tennessee is the province of Franklin, nice deep cut joke there. Other names are just bizarrely too on the nose or bad. Ohio is Hilo, Georgia is Peachtree, Missouri is Show Me. Then a lot of places are also just puns. Not even like same root word linguistic puns, just dad joke puns. Maryland is Peter Paulandia. Get it? Like Peter, Paul, and Mary? There's a city that is the equivalent to Selma in Alabama, and it's called Hayek. Get it? Like Salma Hayek? So yeah, the naming really sticks out in a bad way. But what about the story? Well, it's the American Civil War, but with unicorns and wizardry. The first book, Century's Peak, does start essentially in not 1862 by going through some battles between General Guildenstern and Count Thraxton the Braggart. The second book, Marching Through Peachtree, is of course analogous to General Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia. The third book, Advance and Retreat, involves the defeat of the North, and the abolishment of serfdom. Now, of course, the events aren't exactly 100% the same, but the basic events are the same. But what about the fantasy stuff? Well, soldiers have crossbows instead of rifles, generals are basically wizards, and they do cast spells. A lot of spells kind of follow the Harry Potter rules where they just shoot out like bullets or get stopped by counter spells, but there are also spells that do things like change the weather to help the outcome of a battle. Unicorns exist, but they're basically used as cavalry for obvious reasons, although occasionally they'll use their horns to stab soldiers. Meanwhile, despite both sides using dragons on their official banners, dragons are basically considered near extinct in this universe, and except for one scene in which one is briefly summoned, they basically don't exist in the entire series. The one interesting thing it does have, however, are flying carpets. Flying carpets exist, but aren't quite as acrobatic and aerodynamic as like the ones in Aladdin. In this series, the carpets are connected to magical paths called glideways. They do float and can carry people or supplies, but they can only do so along these paths. This is clearly a way to make stand-ins for railways and trains, so on the one hand it does add to the whole copy and paste nature of the series, but on the other hand, flying carpets aren't usually featured in Western fantasy stories, so it's at least a more creative and unique stand-in. There's also a neat feature where each side of the war uses different magical systems for security reasons, so Southern forces can't use their carpets on Northern glideways or vice versa. That's kind of a neat detail, almost treating magic like operating systems. Frankly though, I find there's little else to talk about. The characters are just stand-ins for real historical figures, the course of events are basically the same, and while there are a few neat battle scenes, nothing really wowed me. If anything, there were also a few things that were left out, like why start in the middle of not 1862 and not show the beginning of the war? They had a character that was analogous to John Wilkes Booth, but it does not mention the fate of King Avram. Does he get assassinated like Abraham Lincoln? Based on how the series goes, I would assume so, but it didn't really mention it. While it's cool to imagine magic carpets, unicorns, and crossbows, I feel like keeping everything tied to the same events of the Civil War, but with a palette swap, just limits the story potential. While this wasn't anything close to the worst thing I've read, not by a long shot, it was probably the most boring for me, if only because I could see everything coming ahead of time as I'm reading it. But who knows, maybe you'll like it. This series is basically American Civil War fan fiction. Fan fiction is not for everyone, but the people who love it really love it. If there can be a popular My Little Pony Fallout fan fiction crossover with a dedicated fan base, yes, it's real, look it up, then I can see a lot of people liking this concept. Whether they'll like this story with the concept depends on how much they can tolerate a recycled timeline. Be sure to also watch Alternate History Hub's video where he'll be talking about a similar Turtledove series, but it's World War II plus magic. What could possibly go wrong there? I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.